Well, I hope everybody is continuing to do well. I am looking forward greatly to the resumption of all of our services and Bible classes starting this Sunday. So mark that down if you haven't done so. This coming Sunday, we will meet for Bible study at 9 o'clock like we always did before and have our regular worship at 10. So that's going to be great to get back to that kind of routine again. In this last video lecture for Isaiah, and I hope it is the last time that we have to do these video lectures, but we're going to cover Isaiah 7 and most of chapter 8, hopefully in the next few moments. So if you want to get your Bible out and follow along, that would be great. I'll have the text on the screen here, of course, if you want to watch that instead. In verses 1 and 2 actually of Isaiah 7, we read that it came about in the days of King Ahaz. Now remember in chapter 6 that Isaiah had this vision of God, God above the temple in all of his glory and holiness. And that happened in the year that King Uzziah died. And so now we have gone to the next king of Judah, King Ahaz. So sometime during the reign of King Ahaz here, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. So get the picture here. Uzziah is gone. King Jotham, who was Uzziah's son, has reigned for the years of his reign. That's been skipped over, and now we're in the time of Ahaz. And during the time of Ahaz, a war breaks out. And you can see here in the text that the king of Aram, Aram is Syria. So the king of Syria and the king of Israel, whose name is Pekah at this time, combined their forces to go up to Jerusalem to wage war against it. This is a war that historians call the Syro-Ephraimite War. Syro for Syrian, Ephraimite for the Israelites. So it is a war of the combined forces of Syria and Israel against the people of Judah. Remember the background here, and it'll make sense, I think, why this war gets started if we think about the background. Starting in 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser has become the king of Assyria, and he is now going to make Assyria a great power again. He is expanding Assyrian control in just about every direction, including toward the west, toward the land of Israel. So Assyria is expanding. They are on the move. They are sending their armies and invading countries all around. Well, earlier in Israel's history, King Menahem of Israel had paid off the Assyrian king to avoid invasion. This was a very common thing. We're going to see it again in the text we're looking at here today, that the Assyrians would make an offer, basically, that if you want to submit peacefully and pay us tribute money, then we'll leave you alone. And so King Menahem of Israel, one of the previous kings of Israel, two kings before the present one, King Pekah here, had decided that that's what he wanted to do. The present king, however, King Pekah has decided that he doesn't want to do that. The text of the Bible doesn't tell us why he changed his course, although it's probably not too hard to figure out. If you think about it, this paying tribute to Israel here, where is the king going to get the money to make this payment to the Assyrians? Well, he's going to get most of it from the wealthy people in his kingdom. And of course, you can't just keep on taxing the wealthy until they're broke. And so most scholars believe that it is probably fairly likely that the rich people, the elite, the aristocrats in Israel, came to King Pekah and said, we're not going to be paying this tribute generation, year after year after year. That is a credible scenario for why the king decides to stand against the Assyrians, and Syria decides that they don't want their land invaded either. So they believe that if we join forces, that maybe no one of our nations can hold off the Assyrians, but if we join forces, the armies of several nations may be able to stop this Assyrian advance. Of course, Syria and Israel wanted Judah to join in with this plan, but the king of Judah said, no, I don't want to be any part of it. And so these northern two nations, Syria and Israel, decided that if King Ahaz is not going to join our coalition peacefully, then we'll launch a war against his kingdom, we'll kick him off the throne, and we'll get a man on the throne in Judah who will join our little coalition. And so this is what the Syro-Ephraimite War was. It was a war launched by Syria and Israel to force Judah to stand with them against the king of Assyria. We're also told, however, in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, that this is a punishment for the sins of King Ahaz. If you'll see in the text here, Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king. He reigned 16 years. He did not do right in the sight of the Lord, as David his father had done, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He made molten images for the Baals. He burned incense in the valley of Ben Hinnom and burned his sons in fire. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first Israelite king, a king of Judah, that did this, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel. In other words, he's acting like a pagan here. He's doing exactly what the pagans had done that God had kicked out of the land. He sacrificed and burned incense on the high places, on the hills, under every green tree. Therefore the Lord delivered him into the hand of the Arameans and the king of Israel. And so this Syro-Ephraimite war is described here in 2 Chronicles 28, but the point is that the chronicler tells us that this war is not just politics, it is also punishment for the sins of Ahaz. So that is the setting here in Isaiah chapter 7, that verses 1 and 2, this war is going on. We know from other places in the Bible, particularly in the text in Chronicles there, that Judah suffered some very heavy losses. And if you want to go back and read 2 Chronicles 28, starting in verse 6, you can read about just how heavy these losses were. Also, we know from the text in Chronicles, what the map shows us here, that the Syrians had actually sent forces all the way down to the south of Judah's territory. And there is a port here called Elath, and so by cutting off the port, any way of supplying the country from other means is cut off. And so you can see that the troops and the armies are coming down from the north. The south has been shut off, and so the vice is kind of tightening on King Ahaz. What is he going to do? What is going to be the remedy for this? He's being attacked on two fronts by a combined army, and it just doesn't look good. We're told here in verse 2 of Isaiah's text, when it was reported to the the royal household, that the Arameans have made it all the way down to the territory of Ephraim, which is right in here on the map. Remember, there used to be Benjamin here and then Ephraim right above that. So the Arameans have made it all the way down to the northern border of Judah. And it says his heart and the hearts of his people were shaking like trees in the wind. So it is in this situation that Isaiah chapter 7 takes place. So in verse 3, the Lord says to Isaiah, "Go out and meet King Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field." This is an aerial view of Jerusalem today, or part of Jerusalem. It's the part that is called the City of David. There was a spring, you can see here on the image it says Gihon Spring, that actually starts underground and came out of the side of the hill. And the question of the water supplies of ancient Jerusalem is a mess. We won't go into that. Figuring out what ran where at what time is very, very difficult. But the picture here in Isaiah 7 seems to suggest that this spring ran down through the valley here and ended at some kind of pool that was just by what was called the fuller's field. The fuller's field is where they washed the fleece of sheep, and you needed a lot of water to do that. So this spring apparently ran down to the southern end of the city of David, where there was a pool and a field for sheep shearing. And it's down there in that area that King Ahaz is there. And most scholars believe that Ahaz is probably doing something like checking the defensibility of the city's water supply. Because if the water supply is outside of the city, you got a problem if the enemy is going to attack. So the king is down there checking out the water, and Isaiah comes to him. And Isaiah has a very simple message. He says to the king, "Take care and be calm. Have no fear. Don't be faint-hearted because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands." And what he refers to there is Syria and Israel. He says they're like stubs of firebrands. They are like sticks that used to be on fire, but they have gone out, and now they're just smoldering and smoking, but they are not a threat to anything. They are sticks that are about to be extinguished of what little fire they've got left in them, is the idea. You're afraid of the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah, Pekah, because they have planned evil against you, and they said, "Let's go up to Judah and let's tear into the walls, and we'll set up the son of Tabeel as king. We'll get rid of Ahaz and put another man on the throne." And this is what, of course, Ahaz is exactly worried about. And so God says to him in verse 7, "It will not stand, and it's not going to happen." So don't worry about that. What you need to do is just trust in God. Don't worry about the city's water supply. Don't worry about where you're going to get help. And certainly don't go asking the king of Assyria to rescue you, which is what we know Ahaz ultimately did. He called on the Assyrians to help him out of this. And I think if we can read between the lines a little bit here, it may well be that Ahaz has already decided that that's what he's going to do. He hasn't done it quite yet, but that is his plan. And so Isaiah comes to him at this moment and says, "You don't need to worry about anything, and there's certainly no need to go asking Assyria for help, because God says that this war that is launched against you right now is going to come to nothing." He says in verse 8, "The head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin." The head of Ephraim is Samaria. The head of Samaria is King Pekah, the son of Remaliah. And what Isaiah means by that is that these are relatively small kingdoms, that really all it comes down to is that their power is in this one little spot and in these two people. That's really all it comes down to. But God, the implication is king of all the world. As we'll see here in a little bit, God says, I control the nations. I whistle for a nation to come and do my bidding, and it comes. So don't worry about these little nations like Syria or Israel, who have this very small base of power. What you need to do is trust in God, who rules over all things. And we have here that famous challenge then in verse 9, that if you will not believe, you will not last. And so the challenge is given to King Ahaz. You need to trust in God. Your only way out of this situation is to trust in God. God says he's not going to let this happen, so don't act like an unbeliever. Trust in God. And if you don't trust in God, then you're not going to last. What's interesting here, and I think this is part of the story actually, you'll notice the next thing we're told in verse 10 is, then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz. So what is Ahaz's response to verse 9? Well, the narrative is silent about that. And I think this silence here means that Ahaz won't answer. That God says, trust in me. Isaiah says, trust in God. This is the way out of this situation. But the king won't do it. He will not say, you know what, I think you're right. I will trust in it. He won't give that kind of answer. His silence is significant. He will not listen to this message. He will not believe. You remember what we were told in Isaiah chapter 6, that Isaiah was sent to a people who would not listen, would not perceive, and would not understand. And so Ahaz, by his silence in this narrative, proves that he is one of those people, that the leadership of Judah is exactly that way. Well, Ahaz won't do it. And so God says, tell you what, if you're afraid, if you really don't, think that you can trust me, then ask for a sign. I'll be happy to give you a sign. I'll be happy to do whatever you want, will encourage you to trust in me. And so notice the invitation. Ask for a sign from the Lord your God. Make it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. You can ask whatever you want. Ask for something really difficult. Ask for something really spectacular. Make it so unusual that it will be unmistakable that this is a sign. And God will give you the sign because God wants you to trust in him. But the king says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Now he gives a religious reason. I don't want to put God to the test. I would never ask for a sign. I know that God doesn't like it when we put him to the test and demand that he shows us miracles and signs. He apparently knows enough of the biblical history to know that. And so he uses that as an excuse. Now, obviously, Ahaz is not a pious man. He's not a religious man. This is not the words of a man who is sincerely afraid of offending God, because he's just been told, God says in this situation that you can ask for a sign. If you're unsure, ask and God will help you out. But what Ahaz means is, I've got my mind made up. I don't want to trust in God. I don't want a sign. I don't want to be forced into trusting in God, because that's not what I want to do. His plans are elsewhere, and he doesn't want to be changed in his thinking. So God gets angry. He says in verse 13, "Listen now, O house of David, is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will now try my patience? I said, ask for a sign. I told you it's okay, and you want to act like, I'm suggesting something inappropriate here." God says, "I'm tired of this. You try my patience. So tell you what," verse 14, God says, "I'm going to give you a sign anyway. I'm going to give you a sign and make it clear to you that you should be trusting in me. I know you didn't ask for it, but God also knows that King Ahaz is the kind of guy who doesn't want to consider it. And so God says, I'm going to make you consider it. And I'm going to give you a sign as a reminder of what's going on here." So this sign, of course, is one of the most well-known texts in all the book of Isaiah, and it demands a little bit of our attention. So God says, here's what's going to happen. A virgin, and the word virgin there doesn't have to mean, literally a virgin. It is a young woman of marriageable age, child-producing age. A young woman will be with child and bear a son. So a child is going to be born. This child will also be given a symbolic name, Emmanuel, which in the Hebrew language means God with us, or God is with us. So look at the sign that God is giving to Ahaz here. "You don't think that I'll be with you, do you, Ahaz? I'm willing to show you that I'm on your side." But Ahaz says, "Oh no, I don't want to hear that. I'm going to go trust in Assyria." So God says, "Well, I'm going to show you that I'm on your side. There will be a child born whose name will mean that I am with you." The appearance, the birth of this child, when he comes into the world, will therefore serve as a confirmation of what else is going to happen. Notice what God says is going to happen once this child is born. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. That sounds like a strange thing to us. What does it mean to eat curds and honey? Well, if we skip on down here to verse 22, because of the abundance of the milk produced, a man will eat curds, and everyone that is left within the land will eat curds and honey. And in verse 21, a man will keep alive a single heifer and one pair of sheep. The picture that is painted here later on in the text is that the land will have been invaded. Most of its people will be gone. You're not going to need a lot of food to feed the people that are left. It will be enough if a man has one cow and two sheep, and he'll be able to survive on that. Regular farming will not be going on anymore. Regular farming activities won't even be necessary because there's not going to be a lot of people left here. And so that's what we're being told up here in verse 15. By the time he knows to choose right and wrong for himself, which would be somewhere between 12 and 20 years old, that by that time he'll be eating the food of desolation. Before the boy gets to that point in verse 16, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. So the picture is God says, well, a child is going to be born. And while that child is still very young, these two kings, the kings of Syria and the kings of Israel, will have disappeared and their threat will have disappeared. But before that child gets to be fully grown, the land will have been devastated. And so it's good news and bad news at the same time. The threat to Judah will be gone very soon after this child appears, and we're going to see more about that in chapter 8. But this child is going to grow up in some very difficult times. It's important, I think, that we understand that this is not only what God is saying about Ahaz in this situation, that what we're reading here really is, in a sense, the heart and soul of the message of Isaiah. And I don't want to, overemphasize that or overstate it, but there is this theme running throughout the core of Isaiah, that God is going to fix the problem with his people through punishment. He's going to unleash his wrath. This difficulty will clear the wicked and the idolaters from among his people, and what will be left is a remnant, a group of faithful people. And that's what you hear being reflected in this text as well. That God's going to take care of this little situation, the Syro-Ephraimite war. That's really nothing to worry about. But the big threat coming is Assyria. And Ahaz, you ought to be worried about that. And so you can see that that is exactly the direction in which the text goes. The Lord is going to bring on you and on your people and on your father's house the king of Assyria. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to just ask for a second, who is this child that Isaiah said is coming along? Some people have thought that it might be the son of King Ahaz, who turns out to be King Hezekiah. The problem with that is that if our dates are correct for all of this, then Hezekiah was probably already about 6 years old when this prophecy was uttered. So that seems to me to rule out Hezekiah. Some have suggested that it could be some child that is otherwise unknown to us, and there's always that possibility. But I do think a good case can be made that the child is going to be Isaiah's own child, because we're going to read about Isaiah having a son in chapter 8. And this son turns out to be a type of the Messiah. And so this is why this text is quoted at the time of the birth of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. A virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. As we've noted in other contexts, and Jared has pointed out in his Bible classes as well, the way messianic prophecies in the Old Testament very often work is that there is an immediate fulfillment in the time at which the prophecy is spoken, but that near fulfillment becomes a type of the messianic fulfillment. So a child would be born, a child that Ahaz himself would know about. It seems unlikely that God is going to give Ahaz a sign that's not going to happen for another 750 years. No, it has to be something that Ahaz can look at and see. And so there would be a child born in the time of Ahaz, but that child is a type or pattern or illustration of something even greater, the Messiah. And that's why this text is quoted about the birth of Jesus. But verses 17 through 23 go on to talk about how it's not Syria or Israel that you need to worry about, it's the Assyrians, because I am bringing the Assyrians on you. Remember, we noted at the beginning of class that according to 2 Chronicles 28, that all of this is because Ahaz is a wicked man. He's acted like a pagan. God is going to punish him. So notice what God says, I'll whistle for the fly that's in Egypt and the bee that is in Assyria. And Egypt is really not a problem at this point. I think God is just simply using that as an illustration that I can whistle for a nation to come from the south. I can whistle for a nation to come from the east, but all I have to do is call, and the nations will do what I say, because God is the God of the nations. His providence controls the nations of the earth, and they will do his bidding. And I'll make them come here, God says, and they will overflow your land. They'll be on the ravines and the cliffs and in the thorn bushes and at the watering holes. They will be everywhere. You see that going on here later on in this text as well, when we get to chapter 8. But God says, I'm going to bring the Assyrians, and they will humiliate you. In verse 20, the Lord will shave with a razor the head and the hair and remove the beard. That doesn't mean anything to us in our culture, but it was considered shameful in the ancient world to have all of one's hair removed, to have your head hair cut off, the hair of the arms and the legs. And for men, I mean, a sign of masculinity in the ancient world is to have the beard. And so God says, I'm going to cut it all off. I'm going to remove all of those things about you that give you a sense of who you are, that give you a sense of, I'm going to humiliate you. And this doesn't have to be necessarily literal, as if the Assyrians are literally going to shave all the hair off all the men. It is figurative language that could possibly be literal as well. But you'll notice what God says is going to happen, that I'm going to take a lot of people out of your land. A lot of people are going to be gone after the Assyrians come, and a man will only need one cow and a pair of sheep, and the milk that the sheep and the cow produce will be enough to eat. He'll eat curds and honey, and that's all that he will need, and that's all he's going to have, because the farms are going to be gone. Verses 23 through 25. Where there used to be 1,000 vines that were worth tons of money, there'll be nothing but briars and thorns. And so the plush farmlands, the vineyards, the farms are all going to be gone. They will grow up full of briars and thorns. The hills that used to be cultivated with the hoe and growing wheat and all of those things, they'll be overgrown with briars and thorns. It'll be a place where cows wander around, but there's just grazing land for the few cows that are left. But God says, I'm going to take away most of the people. So that's what's going to happen. And God wants King Ahaz to trust in him. But Ahaz won't do it. And because Ahaz is going to be stubborn, God says, well, you're going to pay the price. That same scenario is kind of repeated in chapter 8, but this time not just for the king, but for the people. And so this sign is now given to the people. God says, take yourself a big tablet and write on it in words that are ordinary, that everybody can read. Swift is the booty, speedy is the prey. And you can see that in Hebrew, this is Maher Shalal Hash Baz. So that's what he writes. He writes those words on the placard, and God says, I'm going to have two people witness it, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. This Zechariah is not the prophet Zechariah. This priest here is a priest that was loyal to Ahaz, and Zechariah, if I remember in my notes here correctly, is actually his father-in-law. So God says, get yourself a sign, a big piece of board, and write this name on it, and have these men witness that you wrote it down. And so then what happens is that Isaiah says, I approached my wife, who was a prophetess as well, and we had a child. And what is the child's name? God says, you name this child Maher Shalal Hash Baz, which is exactly the same phrase up here. Swift is the booty and speedy is the prey. So what does that name mean? Well, the meaning is something like the time for invasion and destruction is very, very close. That the time for taking spoils, the time for you to be the prey is happening very quickly. And so the child is born and given this name. And in verse 4, we're told that before the boy knows how to say, my father or my mother, in other words, before the child learns how to say mama and dada, that the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. And so this child is born very, very close to the invasion of the Assyrians. The Assyrians came in 732. And so this boy grew up his first year of life somewhere in the time of 731 to 732 BC. And God says before he starts speaking his first words, the Assyrians will have come and destroyed Damascus, and they will have taken the spoil of Samaria. Now, this is some figurative language, but again, we find out from 2 Chronicles chapter 28 that when the Assyrians came and destroyed the city of Damascus, that they also came and took away the northern territories of the kingdom of Israel, the land of Galilee, and everything north of there. And so God says, the appearance of this child, whose name means destruction is on the way, is a sign that it's about to happen. So this was meant to be a sign for all the people. God said this is going to happen. The child is born and he is given that name. So the appearance of the child is the signal that all of this is about to happen. We mentioned a moment ago that I think a good case can be made that this child is the same child whose birth was predicted back in chapter 7 here. Remember this child that would come along and be called Emmanuel. Notice he will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse good and evil, and before he knows that, this other thing will happen. Notice how similar the language is here, that the child is named, and before he can cry out, then this thing has happened. So the way these two texts are worded leads, at least in my way of thinking, to the pretty natural conclusion that the Emmanuel child of chapter 7 is this child who is also called Maher Shalal Hashbaz, and that he is the sign not only to King Ahaz, but he is the sign to the rest of the people that what God said is about to happen. Remember back in chapter 7, God said that when this child is born, it's going to mean that this threat, the combined threat of Israel and Syria, is about to disappear. And that's exactly what happens here in chapter 8, that the child is born, and by the time it's just a year or so old, the Assyrians come and destroy Damascus and take away the northern part of Israel. In verses 5 through 8, we have further explanation of all of this. Why is it that God is sending the Assyrians? I mean, God has sent this sign. The appearance of the boy means that the Assyrians are coming. And God's point is that they're not going to stop with the Syrians and the Israelites. They're also eventually going to come in the lifetime of this child, and they are going to devastate the land of Judah, the kingdom of Ahaz as well. So why is God going to do that? God says in verse 6, They have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah. Remember, we started the class with that picture of the water supply of Jerusalem. The king is out there looking at the water supply. The Gihon spring is like a little creek, a little spring that flows alongside the city into a pool. And God says, that's like me. I'm like the gently flowing waters. And the point that God is making is that it doesn't seem significant to you. It's just a little creek. It's just a little stream. It's not a big, powerful, raging river. And God says that I'm like that to my people, that I'm little to them. I'm nothing to them. And yet I am the source of their life. And so God says, I'm like that spring, gently flowing waters of Shiloah. The people do not think it's, anything big. They reject me and they rejoice in the in Rezin and the son of Remaliah. But the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates. The Euphrates is, of course, the natural border between Assyria and the land of Palestine. And it is a big river. It is a river that is comparable to the Mississippi River in our country. A wide river, deep in many places, difficult to cross. It's not some gently flowing stream. It is a full-on river. And God said, so because you refuse to trust in me, the gently flowing stream, I'm going to bring the river of the army of Assyria onto you, even the king of Assyria and his glory, and it's going to be like a river that floods its banks and covers everything. It will sweep into Judah, overflow, pass through, and reach up to your neck. That I'm going to send these Assyrians. They're not just going to take care of Syria and Israel, but they are going to come to Judah and wreak havoc in the land of Judah. That's what we just saw up there, remember, at the end of chapter 7, that the land is going to be devastated. He's going to bring the Assyrians. They're going to be everywhere, and they're going to take away the people. And so that's what we're hearing here again, that Assyria will be like a great river that has overflowed its banks and destroys even as far as the land of Judah. You'll notice here at the very end of that statement that God refers to the land as in the possession of Emmanuel. And that brings God to say that for the faithful, of course, they will be different. Verses 9 and 10 are what the faithful say. Be broken, O peoples, and be shattered. Give ear, all remote places of the earth. Gird yourselves. Go ahead and devise a plan, but God will thwart it. Make a proposal, but it's not going to stand because God is with us. We're going to see this as we've already seen it in the book of Isaiah, this going back and forth between the unfaithful and the faithful. We have this picture of the unfaithfulness of Ahaz and the people versus the faithful who will stand. And that's what we're getting here in verses 9 and 10. And God wants to make sure that Isaiah is part of this faithful group. And so the Lord spoke with me with mighty power and said, don't be like this people. Don't say that things are a conspiracy. And the point is not a particular conspiracy, but the point, I think, is rather that they are not to be thinking in human terms. What's this king up to? What's this going to come out to be? Why are the kings making what's that everything's a big conspiracy, that they're looking at everything on only the human level of things? God says, don't think like that. It is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy. He shall be your fear and he shall be your dread. Isaiah, don't you think merely in human terms like Ahaz and all of his people. You trust in me. And if you do that, then the Lord will become a sanctuary, a safe place. And that's this picture that we just saw up here in verses 9 and 10, that for those who say God is with us, it doesn't matter what the nations are plotting, because the faithful will say, you plan what you want to, it will not stand because God is going to take care of us. And so the fate of the faithful does not rest in the hands of the nations, but in God's hands. And Isaiah is warned not to think like the people, but to trust in God. Regard the Lord as holy. Remember, that was the point in Isaiah chapter 6, holy, holy, holy. And Isaiah needed to remember that. This trust will result in safety. As we noted here, that God will become a sanctuary for those who fear the Lord. But to both the houses of Israel, he will become a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over, a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Because you see, what God is demanding of his people is the very thing they don't want to do, and that is trust in him. King Ahaz is the perfect example of that. God invites him to trust in him. Ask me for a sign. And Ahaz will not do it because he doesn't want to trust in God. And now the people are the same way. God says in Isaiah 8 here, don't you be like them. Don't you think in human terms that this is all about a human solution, Isaiah. You trust in me, because it's the people who trust in me that will be safe. And it is the people who will refuse to trust that will find that they stumble. This demand for trusting in God is the very thing that most of these people do not want to do. It is the thing that they will stumble over. And that is why this text is quoted in the book of Romans about the Jewish people in Paul's day, that they stumbled over the stumbling block of Jesus. God was inviting them to believe in the Messiah. And just like the people of Isaiah's day, they did not want to do it. So God says they're going to stumble over this. They're going to fall and be broken, snared and caught. The reason they're going to be snared and caught and be broken and suffer this punishment that I'm bringing by the Assyrians is because they will not trust in me. And so this text kind of gets to the heart of the matter, and it brings back what God had said to Ahaz back in chapter 7, verse 9, that if you do not believe, you will not last. And so we'll end with this notice that Isaiah says, that's what I'm going to do. Bind up the testimony, seal the demand or God's law among my disciples. In other words, Isaiah is saying, I've signed my name to it, wrap it up, record it, file it, make it a permanent record that I will wait for the Lord. I'm not going to put my trust in people and the kings of the nations to work all of this out. I will wait eagerly for the Lord. Not only I, but my family will as well. And we will be as a sign and wonder in the land of Israel. How can you trust in God? That will be the wonder. Because nobody wants to do that in Isaiah's day. They see it as foolish. But God says we will be vindicated. Isaiah says that my family and I will turn out to be a sign, that we will be vindicated, that it is the right thing to do to trust in God. We're going to stop at that point because the next paragraph, really the thought of it goes more properly with chapter 9, and I think it'd be better to cover that there. So we'll stop here at verse 18. I hope that this study, as always, has been beneficial to you.